The signal came from a sky that had been empty for 19 minutes. Fleet Admiral Yara Okonkwo stood at the center of the bridge, her scarred left hand resting on the console. Behind her, on a shelf bolted to the bulkhead, sat a chipped ceramic cup. It had belonged to her grandmother. The cup had seen 24 years of service, 11 years of silence, and now this, a transmission channel open, a voice on the other end that was not human, and a fleet dying in orbit above a colony that did not officially exist. She did not raise her voice. She had not raised her voice at a council meeting in 11 years. "You picked the quiet one," she said. The channel closed. On the tactical display, the last Koreth capital ship went dark. The bridge of the Aegis held its breath. 32 crew members. No one spoke. Yara reached for the cup. She drank the tea which had gone cold. "I wish I could tell you it ended there. It didn't. Stay close." 3 days earlier, the Galactic Concord had voted to erase a colony. The chamber was carved from the hollowed core of a dead moon. The ceiling rose 800 meters into haze. Thousands of seats spiraled outward in concentric rings, each holding a representative of one of 4,200 species. The air smelled of ozone, old stone, and the chemical signatures of 4,200 different respiratory systems. It was not a government. It was a ledger, a record of who owned what, who owed whom, and which species were currently at war. 73 conflicts were active. Earth was not among them. In the human section, a single worn chair sat at the edge of the outer ring. The edges of its armrests were polished smooth by palms that had rested there for 11 years of silence. Ambassador Kael Voss, 61 years old, 847 sessions without speaking, sat in that chair. His hands lay flat on his knees. He did not fidget. He had not fidgeted since the first session, when he had learned that stillness was the only language the conquered respected. High Arbiter Druoth filled the central platform. He was six-limbed, reptilian, his scales like burnished copper. He was 312 years old and had prosecuted 4 wars of annexation. He had never lost. He spoke with the calm of a species that had never known defeat. "The colony at Ethon 7, Druoth said, is unregistered. It has no orbital defense, no standing militia, no trade agreements on file." He paused, letting the words settle. "Earth has declared nothing in 11 years. If they will not speak for it, it does not exist." A murmur moved through the rings. Not surprise, the conquered had erased unregistered colonies before. The murmur was ritual, the sound of 4,200 species performing due diligence. Vex Solari stood on the third tier. She was 0.3 meters tall, her voice like wind through dry grass. "The colony has 12,000 residents," she said. 3 schools, 1 hospital." "The ledger does not recognize children," Druoth replied. "The ledger recognizes registration." The vote took 11 minutes. The result was not close. 2,891 species voted to strike the colony from the record. 14 voted against. The human delegation, 1 chair, 1 ambassador, abstained in the only way they could. Kael Voss made a note on a slip of paper. He folded it once. He placed it in his pocket. The note contained a date and a name. Ethon 7. The day it would happen. He did not speak. He had not spoken in 847 sessions. Yara Okonkwo learned of the vote at 4:17 in the morning, ship time. She was in her quarters aboard the Aegis, drinking tea from the chipped ceramic cup. The cup had a hairline crack near the rim that her grandmother had never minded. Yara had carried it from Lagos to the Lunar Academy, from the academy to her first posting, from that posting through a reactor accident that had scarred her left hand and taught her that some silences were not empty. They were full of things waiting. The report came from Commander Samir Patel. He was 39 Tactical Division and had modified his console 14 times to suit his preferences. A faded red scarf, his daughter's, was tucked into his collar. He delivered the news without inflection, the way he had been trained. "Fleet Admiral, the Concord voted 2 hours ago. Ethan 7 is unregistered. The Koreth expansion arm has been authorized to annex. Yara set down the cup. She looked at the report for 11 seconds. She did not blink. "Get me Lieutenant Chen." Mei Chen arrived in 4 minutes. She was 28, Intelligence Division, and had a photograph of her parents' farm taped to the edge of her station. She had found the pattern in 7 minutes, though she had been looking for 9 years. "The Koreth have been mapping Earth-adjacent space," Mei said. "They cataloged 23 colonies, 14 mining stations, 6 research outposts." She paused. "All unregistered, all not existing." Yara's scarred hand tightened on the cup. "Protocol 7. Stage 4, Mei said. "It's never been activated." Yara stood. She walked to the viewport. The Aegis hung in the Kuiper Belt's debris field, its hull non-reflective black, its registry deliberately absent. 46 other ships floated in the dark around it, invisible to any sensor that did not already know where to look. They had been built in shipyards hidden in the belt's shadow, constructed from materials diverted through routes that left no paper trail, crewed by personnel who had been trained in silence. 11 years of silence, not cowardice, preparation. "Wake the long silence," Yara said. The order traveled through encrypted channels. It did not echo. It did not announce itself. It simply arrived, and things that had been sleeping began to move. 2,400 autonomous defense platforms stirred in asteroid belts across 12 colony systems. They had been seeded 9 years ago, placed in orbits that looked like debris, powered down to temperatures indistinguishable from rock. Now they warmed their targeting systems. Now they waited for a signal that would tell them which sky to defend. On the surface of Ethan 7, the colony went about its morning. Children walked to school. A hydroponics bay filled with the smell of tomatoes. A doctor checked a patient's blood pressure in the hospital. No one looked up. No one knew that above them, 8 Koreth capital ships and 24 support vessels had dropped from jump space, their hulls bright with the arrogance of a species that had never been refused. Drueth was not aboard the fleet. He was on the surface, in the command center of the lead capital ship, watching the colony through screens. His 6 limbs rested easy. His 4 wars of annexation had taught him that resistance followed a pattern: first denial, then negotiation, then surrender. He had never seen a 4th stage. He did not expect one now. "Begin landing sequences," he said. 340,000 troops. The colony will be registered by nightfall. The first transport ships descended through atmosphere. The colony's single communication array, civilian, unencrypted, sent a distress signal. It was not answered. The conquered had already voted. The ledger had already erased them. In the hydroponics bay, a woman named Aisha stopped watering her tomatoes. She was 7 years old and liked drawing animals with chalk on the floor of her family's HAB unit. She looked up at the ceiling, though she could not see through it. She felt the vibration of something large passing overhead. She did not know what it was. She went back to her tomatoes. Above her, the Koreth fleet settled into orbital position. The sky was theirs. The ground would follow. Drueth checked the time. He had allotted 6 hours for full pacification. He was already thinking about which world to recommend next. On the Aegis, Yara Okonkwo strapped into her command chair. The cup sat on the shelf behind her, where she could reach it without turning. Her scarred left hand rested on the armrest. Her right hand hovered over the comms array. "Status," she said. Samir Patel's voice came back steady. "All 47 ships report green. Platforms are warm. We are in position." "Mei Chen," Yara said. "Koreth fleet is stationary. They have not deployed countermeasures. They are not scanning for stealth signatures." A pause. "They think we're cowards. They think we're quiet." Yara looked at the tactical display. The Koreth ships were bright icons, confident and exposed. Her own fleet was not visible, not because it was not there, but because it had been built to be seen only when it chose to be. Open a channel, Yara said. All ships, all platforms. The channel opened. It did not broadcast, it waited. Yara picked up the cup. She drank the last of the cold tea. She set it back on the shelf. Stage 4, she said. Execute. The Aegis did not announce itself. It simply fired. The first Korath capital ship died without warning. Its shields were up. Its point defense systems were active. Its crew of 12,000 had been preparing for landing operations, not combat. The Aegis fired a single kinetic slug from a railgun that had been calibrated in the dark for 11 years. The slug traveled at a speed that left no time for alarm. It punched through the Korath ship's ventral armor, a section Drueth's engineers had deemed non-critical because no enemy had ever reached firing range without being detected first. The ship did not explode. It broke. A hull breach opened to vacuum, and the vessel folded along its spine like a hand closing into a fist. Debris sprayed across the orbital lane. Some of it struck the second capital ship. Before that crew understood they were under attack. Samir Patel's voice was flat. Target 1 is down. No survivors. Mei Chen tracked the debris field from her station. The farm photograph in her peripheral vision showed her parents standing in a rice paddy, their faces turned toward a sun that was not this one. She did not look at it. She looked at the sensor readouts, where 47 invisible ships were now firing on an enemy that still did not know where the shots came from. Target 2 is maneuvering, she said. They're trying to raise shields on the starboard side. They don't know we're above them. Yara did not answer. Her scarred hand rested on the console. Her eyes moved across the tactical display, reading patterns that only a reactor accident and 24 years of waiting could teach a person to see. The Korath fleet was reacting the way Drueth's 4 wars had trained them to react. They were forming a defensive shell, protecting the troop transports, assuming the threat would come from a single direction, from a force they could see and measure. They had never fought an enemy that surrounded them before the first shot. Target 3 is firing blind, Samir said. They're shooting at their own debris. Hold position, Yara said. Let them panic. The second capital ship died 4 minutes after the first. It was not a railgun that killed it. One of the autonomous platforms, a piece of rock that had orbited Ethon 7's asteroid belt for 9 years, cold and dark and unregistered, opened fire with a particle beam that had no business existing on a civilian registry. The beam sliced the ship's engine cluster in half. The vessel spun, out of control, and collided with a support ship that had been trying to flank the non-existent threat. On the surface, Drueth felt the vibration through the command center's deck. He looked up. His scales caught the emergency lighting, and for the first time in 312 years, he did not know what was happening. Report, he said. Multiple contacts, his sensor officer said. The officer's voice was wrong, too high, too fast. We are reading. We are reading ships that were not there. They are everywhere. How many? I cannot, the count is, the officer stopped. 47 capital-class signatures and something else. The asteroid belt is firing. Drueth's upper limbs tightened on the command rail. He had prosecuted 4 wars. He had taken worlds. He had never encountered an enemy who chose not to exist until they chose to. Recall the transports, he said. All ships, defensive formation now. It was too late. The defensive formation assumed an external threat, a force arriving from outside the system. The human fleet was already inside. They had been inside for years. Mei Chen watched the third capital ship die. It tried to run. It burned its engines hard, pushing for jump space, and ran directly into a cluster of platforms that had been waiting in its escape vector since before the colony was founded. The platforms did not fire warning shots. They simply detonated, turning the ship's own velocity into a weapon that shredded its hull. 3 of 8 down, Mei said. 7 minutes elapsed. Samir's hand hovered over his console. He did not press anything. The red scarf at his collar had come loose, and he did not fix it. "They're not fighting back," he said. "They're just dying." "They don't know how," Yara said. She reached for the cup on the shelf behind her. The tea was cold. She drank it anyway. The ceramic was warm from her hand, from the heat of the bridge, from the 24 years it had traveled with her. She set it back on the shelf, and her fingers left a smudge on the rim that she did not wipe away. "Continue," she said. The 4th Capital ship died trying to protect the troop transports. Its captain made a decision that would have been correct in any of Druoth's 4 wars. He placed his vessel between the enemy and the ground forces. He did not know that the enemy was not coming from one direction. The platforms in the asteroid belt fired in a synchronized pattern that turned the ship's shield into a lens, focusing energy back through its own hull. The ship became a star for 3 seconds. Then it was debris. "4 down," Samir said. His voice was not flat anymore. It was something else, something that had not been used in 11 years. On the surface, the colony's children were still in school. The doctor was still checking blood pressure. Aisha was still in the hydroponics bay, though she had stopped watering the tomatoes. She was looking at the ceiling where the sound of something breaking had become constant, a rhythm like distant thunder. She did not know what it was. She drew an animal on the floor with her finger. A bird, she thought, something with wings. Druoth watched his 5th Capital ship die on the main screen. It had been his flagship, the vessel he had commanded in his 3rd war of annexation. It had taken a world called Thessaly in 9 days. It had held that world's sky for 200 years. Now it was a cloud of metal and vapor, and the cloud was expanding toward his position on the surface. "Get me a channel," Druoth said. "Any channel, open broadcast." "To whom?" "To whoever is firing." The channel opened. It found nothing. The human fleet did not use open frequencies. They did not negotiate. They had not negotiated for 11 years. "Target 5 is down," May said. 8 minutes elapsed. The 6th Capital ship tried something different. Its captain, young by Korath standards, only 80 years old, ordered a full burn toward the planet's surface. The logic was sound. Get below the orbital combat zone, use atmosphere as shield, land among the transports where the enemy could not fire without killing their own colonists. It was a good plan. It would have worked against any enemy Druoth had ever faced. The Aegis was already in the atmosphere. Yara had positioned 2 of her 47 ships in the thermosphere before the battle began, their hulls black against the black of near space, their engines cold. They had been waiting for this. They had been built for this. When the 6th Korath ship descended, the 2 human vessels rose to meet it, and the meeting was brief. The Korath ship was not designed for atmospheric combat. The human ships were. They had trained in the storms of gas giants, in the turbulence of worlds that would have crushed a Korath hull. They knew how to fly where the enemy could not. The 6th ship broke apart over the colony's northern hemisphere. Pieces of it fell into the ocean, into the farmland, into the empty fields beyond the settlement. None of it hit the colony. The targeting had been too precise for that. 6 of 8, Samir said. 9 minutes. Druoth stood in the command center of his 7th ship, the last capital vessel still in orbit, the last one still answering his commands. Around him, the crew moved with the frantic energy of a species that had never learned to lose. They were throwing every countermeasure they had at sensors that could not find a target. They were firing weapons into empty space, hoping to hit something invisible. They were shouting at each other in a language that had not known panic for 3 centuries. "Where are they?" Druoth asked. Not an order, a question. The first question he had asked, in a war that he did not understand. "Everywhere," the sensor officer said. "They are everywhere and they are nowhere. We cannot." The 7th ship's shield failed, not from a single impact. From 100 tiny impacts, platforms firing in sequence, each one too small to trigger the automated defense systems, each one hitting the same stress point until the field collapsed like a wall made of sand. The ship did not die immediately. It lost power. It lost engines. It began to fall slowly toward the planet it had come to take. Druoth felt the deck tilt. He grabbed the command rail with all 6 limbs. On the screen, the last of his support vessels was trying to run, a 24th ship, fleeing the system at maximum burn, its captain having made the only rational decision left. The ship did not make it past the jump threshold. The platforms had been seeded there too. They had been seeded everywhere. 8 minutes to impact, someone said, not to Druoth, to the room, to the air itself. Druoth looked at the screen. He looked at the colony below, where 12,000 humans were going about a day that his fleet had tried to erase. He looked at the sky, where black ships that did not reflect light held position around a world that was not supposed to have defenders. He thought of his 4 wars. He thought of the worlds he had taken, the species he had broken, the certainty that had carried him through 312 years. He had measured fleets, he had measured declarations, he had measured noise. He had never learned to measure silence. "Open a channel," he said. "Open it to the colony, open it to anyone I wish to." The channel opened, but it was not the colony that answered. Yara Okonkwo's voice came through the same frequency Druoth had used to declare the colony unregistered. It was calm. It was not loud. It did not hurry. It said 5 words that Druoth would replay in his mind for the remaining years of his life, trying to understand where he had miscalculated. "You pick the quiet one." The channel closed. On every screen in the command center, the tactical display showed the same thing. The human fleet was not celebrating. The black ships were not firing anymore. They were simply holding position, silent and patient, the way they had held position for 11 years. The 7th capital ship hit the ocean. The impact was not nuclear. The reactors had been shut down by the platform strikes, a precision that Druoth had not thought possible. The ship sank. The water closed over it. On the surface, the colony's children came out of the schools to look at the smoke rising from the horizon. The doctor finished his blood pressure check. Aisha drew another bird on the floor of the hydroponics bay, and this one had wings that were bigger. On the Aegis, Yara picked up the cup. She drank the cold tea. She set it back on the shelf. "Cease fire," she said. "All ships, all platforms, hold." The battle had lasted 19 minutes. The war, if it was a war, had ended before the colony knew it had begun. But the galaxy was still watching. Vex Solari stood in the conquered chamber, 3 hours later on the same platform where Druoth had spoken. The chamber was empty of most species. The vote was over. The ledger had been updated and most delegations had returned to their worlds. But the recording had circulated. The recording of the battle, of the 5 words, of the silence that followed. She was 0.3 meters tall. Her voice was like wind through dry grass. She addressed the empty rings, and the empty rings were not empty. They were full of species listening through channels that had been opened and not closed. "You have made an error," she said. "You have mistaken a silence for an absence." She stepped down. No one spoke, but the channels stayed open. And somewhere in the human section, the worn chair still sat at the edge of the outer ring. The armrests were still polished smooth. And Kale Voss, who had not spoken in 847 sessions, sat in that chair with the folded note still in his pocket, and he looked at the empty platform where Vex Solari had stood, and he did not smile. He had not smiled in 11 years, but his hands were steady. The recording of the battle was played 4 times in the first day. Each time the listener heard the same thing. Not anger, not triumph, not the sound of victory. Just the calm statement of a fact, delivered by a woman who had not raised her voice in 11 years, who had built a fleet in silence and used it in 19 minutes, who was now sitting on her bridge with a chipped ceramic cup in her scarred hand, drinking cold tea while the galaxy tried to understand what it had just seen. The Koreth expansion arm did not prosecute a 5th war of annexation. The conquered ledger was updated. Ethon 7 was registered. The 12,000 dead were counted, though the dead were Koreth, not human, and the counting was done by an empire that had never before counted its own losses. And Yara Okonkwo, who had not spoken at a council meeting in 11 years, who had carried her grandmother's cup through a reactor accident and 24 years of service, and a silence that had been mistaken for emptiness, sat on the bridge of the Aegis and looked at the stars. The cup sat on the shelf behind her. The tea was cold. The galaxy was loud. But she was quiet. The recording did not stop circulating. It moved through channels that had been opened and not closed. It reached the Korath homeworld, where the Expansion Arms Command Council watched it in a chamber lined with the trophies of 4 wars. It reached the mining stations where human cargo pilots, unregistered, invisible, loaded ore, and listened to the 5 words on smuggled receivers, while their ships sat dark on registries that did not list them. It reached the research outposts where scientists who had never held a weapon stopped their work and played the transmission again, trying to understand the tone of a voice that did not shout. On the Aegis, the bridge crew went about their duties with the quiet of people who had expected to feel something and had not. Samir Patel sat at his console, the red scarf still loose at his collar. He had modified the console 14 times over the years, and now he found himself wanting to modify it again, not because it needed changing, but because his hands needed something to do that was not still. He looked at the tactical display, where the 47 ships held position in a sky that was no longer contested. He thought of his daughter, who was 6 years old and had never seen him fire a weapon. He wondered if she would be proud or frightened. He did not know which answer he wanted. Mei Chen removed the photograph of her parents' farm from the edge of her station. She held it in both hands, looking at the faces that had sent her to the stars with rice paddies still on their boots. She had found the pattern in 7 minutes. She had spent 9 years looking for it. Now she wondered what other patterns she had missed, what other silences were full of things waiting. Yara stood at the viewport. The cup was in her hand, cold and empty. She looked at Ethon 7 below, where the colony's lights were coming on as evening fell. The Korath ships were gone. The platforms were dormant again, cooling to the temperature of rock, becoming invisible once more. The sky was empty in the way it had been empty before, not because nothing was there, but because what was there had chosen not to be seen. "Fleet Admiral," Samir said. "Incoming transmission encrypted, source unknown." Yara did not turn. "Play it." The voice that came through was not human. It was Tessari, wind through dry grass, small and patient. "Vex Solari," the voice said. "Not speaking for the conquered, speaking for myself. I have listened to the recording 4 times. Each time I hear something different. The first time I heard victory. The second time I heard warning. The third time I heard grief. The fourth time—" the voice paused. "The fourth time I heard a question, and I think you know what it is." Yara set the cup on the shelf. She turned to face the comms array. "What question?" How many other colonies are unregistered? How many other silences are full of fleets? How many other species have learned to measure strength in ways the conquered cannot read? The channel closed. Yara looked at the empty space where the transmission had been. She thought of the 23 colonies the Korath had catalogued. She thought of the 14 mining stations. She thought of the 6 research outposts. She thought of the worlds that were not on any ledger, the ships that were not on any registry, the people who had learned to be quiet because quiet was the only armor that worked. She thought of her grandmother, who had carried the cup through a war that had not been called a war, through a silence that had lasted longer than 11 years. The cup had a chip near the rim. Her grandmother had never minded it. She had said that a chip was a place where the cup had been used, and used things were honest things. Yara picked up the cup again. She ran her thumb over the chip. The scar on her left hand caught the light from the viewport, a ridge of pale tissue that had not been there before the reactor accident, before she had learned that some things could not be fixed, only carried. "Mei Chen," she said. "Yes, Fleet Admiral." "Run the full mapping again, not just Korath space, all adjacent sectors. I want to know what else is not existing. May hesitated. That will take time, and it will require resources we have kept hidden. Then keep them hidden, Yara said, but find me the silences. May nodded. She replaced the photograph on her station. She began to work. Samir watched her from his console. He watched Yara from the viewport. He thought of the 14 modifications he had made to his station, each one a small act of ownership in a life that was mostly not his own. He thought of the red scarf, which his daughter had given him because it was the only color she could see clearly. He thought of the battle, which had lasted 19 minutes and had changed nothing and had changed everything. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out a stylus. He made the 15th modification, a small thing, a recalibration of the alert tone to something lower, something that would not startle a bridge that had learned to value quiet. On the Korath homeworld, Drueth stood before the Expansion Arms Command Council. He had been stripped of his rank. Not because he had lost, the Korath did not punish failure with demotion, only with death. He had been stripped because the council could not decide what he had done. Had he failed? Had he been outmatched? Had he encountered something that did not fit the categories of war? They played the recording, the 5 words, the calm voice, the silence after. You pick the quiet one. A council member, young, ambitious, with scales that had not yet dulled from age, spoke. This is a fluke. A single species hiding in debris fields building ships without registry. We will adapt our sensors. We will find them. Drueth said nothing. He had said nothing since the battle. He stood in the center of the chamber, his 6 limbs at his sides, his burnished copper scales catching the light of a sun that had warmed his species for millennia. He thought of the 47 ships. He thought of the platforms that had been seeded for 9 years. He thought of the woman who had not raised her voice in 11 years, who had built an army in silence and used it in less time than it took to convene a council. He thought of the chip in the ceramic cup. He had seen it in the recording on the shelf behind her, a small thing, a used thing, an honest thing. It is not a fluke, Drueth said. The council turned to look at him. It was the first time he had spoken since his return. It is a method, he said. They have learned to measure something we do not measure. We count ships, we count registries, we count declarations, they count patience, they count silence, they count the years between when a threat appears and when it is answered. He paused. We have never counted those years, we have never had to. The council was silent. The young member's scales rippled, a sign of agitation. Then we change our methods, the young member said. We find their shipyards, we find their platforms, we register their colonies before they can hide them. Drueth looked at the young member. He looked at the council. He looked at the recording, frozen on the screen, showing the moment before the channel closed, the black ships, the empty sky, the colony that had not known it was defended. You do not understand, Drueth said. The shipyards are not the weapon. The platforms are not the weapon. The fleet is not the weapon. He turned to the screen. He pointed at the shelf behind the woman, at the cup. That is the weapon. The council looked. They saw a chipped ceramic cup. They saw nothing else. She has carried that cup through 24 years of service, Drueth said. Through a reactor accident, through 11 years of silence, through a battle that lasted 19 minutes. And when the battle was over, she picked it up and she drank from it. She did not celebrate. She did not mourn. She simply drank. And then she set it down and looked at the stars. He turned back to the council. That is not a soldier. That is not a general. That is a person who has learned that the only thing more powerful than noise is the choice not to make it. And we have spent 312 years. I have spent 312 years learning to make noise. We do not know how to fight an enemy who has learned to be still. The chamber was quiet. The young member's scales had stopped rippling. What do we do? Someone asked. Drueth looked at the recording one last time. At the cup, at the scarred hand, at the woman who had not raised her voice in 11 years and had changed the galaxy with 5 words. "We learn to listen," he said, "or we learn to be very, very quiet ourselves." On the Aegis, Yara stood at the viewport. The cup was in her hand, warm now from the heat of her palm. She looked at the stars. She thought of the unregistered colonies. She thought of the silences that were full of things waiting. She thought of her grandmother, who had carried the cup through a war that had not been called a war, and who had told her that used things were honest things. She raised the cup. She did not drink. She simply held it, looking at the chip near the rim, at the place where the ceramic had been worn smooth by lips that were no longer alive, by a voice that had spoken in a language that was not English, not Hausa, not any language that the conquered would recognize. "Fleet Admiral," Samir said, "Mei Chen has completed the preliminary scan. She found something." Yara turned. "What?" Samir's voice was different, not flat, not the something else from the battle, something new. She found a pattern in the mapping data, not Korath, something older. Something that has been waiting longer than we have. Yara set the cup on the shelf. She walked to Mei's station. The photograph of the farm was still there. Mei was pointing at the screen, her finger trembling. "Look," Mei said. "The debris fields, the Kuiper belt, the asteroid clusters, they're not random, they've been placed, all of them for longer than 11 years, longer than the conquered has existed." Yara looked at the screen. She saw the pattern. She saw the placement. She saw the silence that was older than her silence, older than human silence, older than the ledger that had tried to erase a colony. "Who placed them?" she asked. Mei looked up, her face was pale. "I don't know, but they're not human, and they're not Korath. And they're not any of the 4,200 species on the conquered registry." She paused. "They're not on any registry, they don't exist, but they've been waiting, for longer than any of us have been alive, for longer than the conquered has been a ledger, for longer than—" She stopped, she looked at Yara, she looked at the cup on the shelf. "For longer than silence has been a word," she said. Yara looked at the screen. She looked at the cup. She looked at the stars, where something was waiting in the dark, something that had learned to be quiet before humans had learned to speak, something that had placed its platforms and its ships and its patience in patterns that spanned millennia. And for the first time in 11 years, Yara Okonkwo felt something she had not allowed herself to feel. She felt heard. Yara did not sleep that night. She sat in her quarters, the cup on the table before her, the screen showing Mei's pattern still glowing in the corner. The pattern was old, older than the conquered, older than the species that had built the ledger, older than the word silence itself. She picked up the cup. She turned it in her hands, feeling the chip near the rim, the smoothness of the glaze where her grandmother's lips had worn it thin. The cup had been made in a village that no longer existed, by hands that had learned to shape clay before humans had learned to shape metal. It had survived a war that had not been called a war. It had survived a reactor accident that had scarred her hand and taught her that some things could not be fixed, only carried. It had survived 11 years of silence on a shelf in a ship that did not officially exist. And now it sat in a room where the screen showed a pattern of waiting that was older than all of that. She thought of Druath, somewhere on the Korath homeworld, stripped of rank but not of understanding. She thought of Vex Solari, listening to the recording 4 times, hearing something new each time. She thought of Kale Voss, sitting in his worn chair with the folded note in his pocket, his hand steady after 847 sessions of silence. She thought of Aisha, drawing birds on the floor of the hydroponics bay, looking up at a sky that had been empty, and then full, and then empty again, never knowing that her world had been defended by a woman who had not raised her voice in 11 years. Yara stood. She walked to the viewport. The stars were out there, and somewhere among them was something that had been waiting longer than humans had been quiet, something that had placed its platforms and its patience in patterns that spanned millennia, something that had learned to be still before the conquered had learned to be loud. She raised the cup. She did not drink. She held it against the glass, so that the stars showed through the chip near the rim, so that the light passed through the place where the ceramic had been worn thin by use and honesty. The chip was not a flaw, it was a window. She saw that now. Her grandmother had known it. The woman who had shaped the clay had known it. Every hand that had held the cup had known it, in the way that hands know things before minds do. The chip was where the light came through. The chip was where the silence became visible. "Fleet Admiral," Samir's voice came through the comm. "Mei Chen has found something else. In the pattern, a signal, buried in the noise. It's old, very old, and it's—" He stopped. "It's answering us." Yara did not lower the cup. She kept it against the glass, the stars showing through the chip, the light passing through the place where honesty had worn the ceramic thin. "Answering what?" she asked. "Not answering a transmission," Samir said. His voice was the something new from before, but deeper now, older. "Answering the silence. The pattern, it's not just placement, it's a response. To us. To what we did, to the 19 minutes, to the 5 words. Something out there heard us, Fleet Admiral. Something that has been waiting for longer than the conquered has existed. And it heard us." Yara looked at the stars through the chip in the cup. She thought of the platforms that had been seated for 9 years, that had waited in cold and dark until they were needed. She thought of the 47 ships that had been built in debris fields, that had learned to be invisible until they chose to be seen. She thought of the 11 years of silence, of the council meetings where she had not spoken, of the ledger that had tried to erase a colony and had instead learned that silence was not absence. She thought of the older silence, the silence that had placed its patterns before humans had learned to shape clay, the silence that had been waiting for longer than silence had been a word. And she understood, in the way that understanding comes not as a thought but as a feeling in the hands, that the cup was not just a cup. It was a message. It was a signal. It was a thing that had been made and used and chipped and carried, not despite the damage but because of it, because the damage was where the light came through, because the damage was where the silence became visible. Her grandmother had carried it through a war. She had carried it through a reactor accident. She had carried it through 11 years of silence and 19 minutes of violence, and now this moment where the stars showed through the chip and something older than the stars was answering. "Fleet Admiral," Samir's voice was small, "what do we do?" Yara lowered the cup. She looked at it. She looked at the chip. She looked at the stars. She did not speak. She had not spoken at a council meeting in 11 years, and she had learned that the most powerful words were the ones you chose not to say. But this was not a council meeting. This was not a ledger. This was a moment where the silence of millennia was meeting the silence of 11 years, where the patience of something older than the conquered was meeting the patience of a woman who had learned to be still. She raised the cup again. She held it to the light. She let the stars show through the chip. And she smiled. Not a big smile, not a victory smile, not the smile of a general who had won a war. The smile of a woman who had carried a chipped cup through 24 years of service and had finally understood what the chip was for. "Samir," she said, "open a channel, wideband. No encryption, no stealth. Open it to everything, to everyone, to the pattern, to the silence, to whatever is waiting." "Fleet Admiral." "Open it." The channel opened. It was not a human frequency. It was not a Korath frequency. It was not any frequency that the conquered would recognize. It was the frequency of the cup, of the chip, of the place where the light came through. It was the frequency of silence made audible. Yara held the cup to the comms array. She did not speak into it. She simply held it there, letting the light from the stars pass through the chip, letting the silence pass through the ceramic, letting the waiting pass through the waiting. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the screen flickered. May's pattern shifted. The placement of the platforms, the debris fields, the asteroid clusters, it changed. Not randomly, not aggressively, gently, like a hand adjusting a cup on a shelf so that the light hits the chip just right. The pattern was not a threat. It had never been a threat. It was an invitation. It was a question. It was a silence that had been waiting for another silence to answer. And Yara, who had not raised her voice in 11 years, who had built a fleet in silence and used it in 19 minutes, who had changed the galaxy with 5 words and a chipped ceramic cup, answered the only way she knew how. She set the cup on the console. She stepped back. She let the light from the stars pass through the chip and into the channel and into the silence beyond. And she waited. The Aegis was quiet. The 47 ships were quiet. The 2,400 platforms were quiet. The galaxy was quiet. And in the quiet, something answered. Not with words, not with weapons, not with declarations or registries or ledgers, with light, with patience, with the slow, patient glow of a star that had been waiting to be seen, that had been visible all along if you knew to look through the chip, through the damage, through the place where honesty wore the ceramic thin. Yara stood at the viewport. The cup sat on the console behind her, the light passing through the chip, the stars showing through the window it made. She did not pick it up. She did not drink from it. She simply stood there, her scarred left hand at her side, her right hand resting on the glass, feeling the cold of space through the hull, feeling the warmth of the light through the chip, feeling the silence that was not empty but full. Samir came to stand beside her. He did not speak. He did not need to. The red scarf was tucked into his collar, neat now, the way his daughter would have wanted it. Mei Chen stood at her station, the photograph of her parents' farm still taped to the edge, her hand resting on the screen where the pattern had shifted from threat to invitation. They stood together, the bridge crew of 32, the fleet of 47, the platforms of 2,400, the colony of 12,000, the species of 4,200. The silence of 11 years, the silence of millennia. All of them waiting, all of them listening, all of them looking through the chip in the cup, through the place where the light came through the damage that made the silence visible. And Yara Okonkwo, who had not spoken at a council meeting in 11 years, who had carried her grandmother's cup through a reactor accident and 24 years of service, and a war that had lasted 19 minutes and a silence that had lasted longer than words, looked at the stars and understood that the quiet was not the end. It was the beginning. The cup sat on the console, the light passed through the chip, the stars showed through. And somewhere in the dark, something that had been waiting for longer than waiting had been a word, looked back through the same window and saw her.